Hi everyone, welcome to the third lesson in our Inspector Calls GCSE revision series. What we're going to be doing in these sessions is going through character analysis, key quotes, themes, context, model answers, maybe a few extracts, just to really boost up your answers for an Inspector Calls if this is one of the texts that you're writing an essay in for your GCSEs. So in the first week, we went through the Inspector. Last week, we went through Mr. Burling, character study. Today, we're going to be going through Eva and looking at some key quotes for her. We're going a bit all over the place. I might neaten this up at some point, but yeah, we're going to be talking about Eva Smith today. And she's also known as Daisy Renton. If you haven't seen either of those videos on Mr. Burling or the Inspector, highly recommend you check them out. They're in the YouTube channel or the Discord if you're part of that. So yeah, we're going to dive straight into Eva Smith. Now, who is Eva Smith? So she's the victim, in some sense, really, of the play. She doesn't have her own voice within the play either. She has already died at the beginning of the play. Towards the end of the play, the Burlings and Gerald ring up the police station and find out there's no Inspector Gould, and the infirmary and find out no one's committed suicide. So we get this sense, for a moment at least, that she's fictional. But then at the very, very end of Act 3, obviously, the Burlings receive a phone call, and the phone call says a young girl has just died in the infirmary from swallowing some strong disinfectant, which is exactly what Inspector Gould said would happen, or had happened. So we get this weird sort of time shift thing going on with Eva Smith. She represents women, so particularly working class women, but she does those things independently of each other as well. So she represents women as well as represent working class women. They kind of intersect. So as women in 1912, Edwardian England, spring 1912, when this is set, this is pre-vote. The women of that time were not allowed to vote in elections, for example. So the Prime Minister would be selected purely through male vote, through who the men voted in. Women got the vote in 1918 in England. That's a good thing to notice and to know about. At that point, it was still not an equal vote, though. They were able to vote if they were 30 or older, whereas men were allowed to vote at 21. 10 years later, in 1928, they had the equal vote with men, which was that everyone at that point could vote at 21. And then I don't know when England changed it, so voting was 18 from 21. Feel free to look that up. That's kind of an interesting thing, I suppose, as well. But so yes, she represented a time where even powerful women like Sybil Burling, who represents the upper class, did not have equality with men. It's an interesting kind of debate to have. Would you rather be a working class man in 1912 or an upper class woman? Not really sure. There's problems for both. Sybil certainly did have a lot of power, even over working class men. That's not what we're talking about, though. We're talking about Eva Smith, obviously. So as a working class woman, she's like at the very bottom of the barrel in the sense that she represents working class. So the issue with working class at that time stems really from the fact that there was no social security net, obviously no NHS. The NHS comes in 1948 in England. No workers' unions either. So this was pre-worker unions. Workers' unions, as you might be aware of, are basically when all of the people who work within a certain industry sort of band together to protect their rights as workers. So they can ask for higher wages, they can ask for more time off, they can ask for certain safety measures, things like that. Probably in England, one of the most obvious, or the two most obvious unions that you probably are a bit aware of, are teacher unions. So there have been teacher strikes. I was a part of a teacher strike probably about 5-10 years ago. There are several different unions for teachers. Also probably tube strikes, you know, if you live in and around London, all the train drivers felt that they weren't getting paid enough or enough holiday. I forget what it was. So there are sometimes tube strikes where there's limited service on those days because the workers aren't there. But this is pre-unionization. So Eva obviously is one of the ringleaders against Mr. Burling because they wanted to ask for a little bit more money. And so they strike. And the strike, he describes it as being kind of pathetic, really, because they just don't have any social security. So if they're not working, they're not earning money, they're not being paid very much as it is. So they don't have huge amounts of savings. You know, they get to a stage where they run completely out of money and then they're at risk of starvation, losing their housing or shelter, whatever. There's no social security. So she represents all of that. She represents a time where particularly working class women had very few rights, very few opportunities. And so what's interesting is Priestley then actually creates a character that perhaps had slightly more opportunities than the average working class woman. And it still doesn't work out well because obviously she works for Mr. Burling. She's part of the strike to get a little bit more money. And they're not even asking for a huge amount more money. They're just asking for a modest pay increase, right? And then that doesn't work out. She gets fired for being more spirited than the other girls. And I say girls because they were all women, young women working in this factory of Mr. Burling's. She gets fired. And then she actually, fortunately, gets a chance to work at another store, which is called, or another place, which is called Millward's, which is a clothing store. And so she actually gets another opportunity, another chance, which is actually fairly rare for a woman of that time in that class, that status. But then obviously that doesn't work out due to Sheila. And then she finally descends into what many working class women, and particularly women who were outside of the protection of a husband or a father, which obviously, you know, not all women were married or had fathers, that if their father, mother died, etc., they were left alone in the world with no social security, as I said. So she's left in that position, and she inevitably ends up in prostitution, which is the fate of many working class women with no security, sadly. So that's how then obviously she ends up with Gerald. She puts on this new persona as Daisy Renton, and then she's working in the Palace Bar, or like trying to sell herself literally in the Palace Bar. There's that whole horrible thing with Alderman Megati as well, that the fact that an elected official, this old man, is like trying to kind of assault her in this Palace Bar. It's very unpleasant. Gerald provides her with a temporary social security. And then there's this irony to that as well, because Gerald represents the very people who are really trying to stop social security nets from being placed on some level. And yet what does he do when he's faced with a working class woman who he finds beautiful and ultimately falls in love with? He provides her with shelter, he provides her with food, he provides her with an allowance. These are all things that are classically provided by a social security net. If someone loses their job, they go into, what they're looking for employment. I forget what it's called. Colloquially, you'll call it going on the dole, right? But like unemployment benefits, so that helps you to pay your house if you have financial commitments, get a bit of food, basically give you what you need till you find another job. But there wasn't any of that in 1912. And Priestley is trying to push for that in 1945 when he writes this and when it's first performed. And it's not a coincidence that it's first performed in Russia, because obviously Russia was very, very socialist and eventually communist. And we could talk about the decline of communism another time, perhaps. But so all of this represents this. All of this is to say that she represents a problem, did not mean to do that, a problem for the Edwardian style capitalism. This is to say a capitalism that doesn't have social security. And Priestley is pushing the solution being possibly socialism. Yeah. Now, that's not purely correct, as we've talked about. When socialism bleeds into communism and everything being done through the state, you end up with Stalinism and things like that, which is not good either. But this is before any of that had been experimented with, really. She's a dynamic character, but she doesn't have her own voice, which makes it very interesting. So she's a dynamic character because we see her change and evolve and grow through the play, but we don't ever get to hear her voice, her words, her ideas. It's always reported through what the other characters say about her. And she represents death, tragedy, and she also helps to emphasize corruption. So obviously Gerald is somewhat corrupted. He has an affair. He's committing adultery again, or yeah, he's cheating on Sheila, right? Eric is super corrupt. He literally sexually assaults and frankly really rapes Eva Smith in a drunken stupor. So that also shows the horrific corruption. And then Alderman Megati, smaller character, worth talking about if things to do with corruption come up or if Eva Smith comes up. Really very corrupted person. And the fact that he represents the peak of the kind of capitalist machine of 1912, it just shows how horrific that is. And it makes us very sad as well, because Eva is this sweet, innocent woman, really, and yet not really for any fault of her own, she ends up in this horrible position where she's in these terrible jobs and eventually prostituting herself. One final thing I'll quickly say about Eva, then we'll dive into some quotes like normal. She represents this fall arc in a similar way to several of the other characters. Now, it's not quite so traditional with Eva, because normally a fall arc is a main character that you kind of watch firsthand, right? Making bad choices, descending, maybe a quick rise to something and then back down. Eva, we don't see any of this. Eva, she starts, in her job. I wouldn't say she's at a really high peak or anything, but she's alive and comfortable and secure to some extent, right? Then there's the workers' strike, which maybe could arguably be also the peak. She's powerful enough that she's trying to improve her world. She gets fired. So that's obviously the first trough, where she's struggling financially, struggling generally. She's a working class woman, so she doesn't have many options in 1912. But then she gets this second opportunity with Millwoods. Millwoods offers her a few months of respite from things, a little bit of security. And then Sheila gets her fired, forces her to be fired. So that's another trough. Now, arguably, you could argue that she's really more of an up and down wave, because then she's prostituting herself, which is obviously a serious low point. But then she meets Gerald, and Gerald shelters and houses her for a while. So technically, she's got another peak here. And then that doesn't work out. So she descends back down, prostitutes herself again. And then arguably, that's really where she falls off a cliff all the way down here, because then she's pregnant with Eric's child after rape. She doesn't want the child to be raised by Eric, but she doesn't want to get rid of the child either, which is quite noble. She goes to Mrs. Burling for help, and obviously it's Sybil Burling. Sybil doesn't help her. She descends further and further into chaos. She doesn't know what to do, and then obviously she kills herself. So there are perhaps a couple of peaks and troughs, but then eventually she descends fully into chaos. And what's really sad about Eva Smith is that she doesn't do it on her own, choices. She's a victim of the world she lives in, really. She tries her best, but she doesn't have many opportunities. So then there are all these quotes that we can go through together for Eva Smith that help to pinpoint some of these ideas about her. So first of all, she starts another kind of life. This is euphemistic or euphemism, euphemistic language. It kind of softens the fact she becomes a prostitute. So it softens the prostitution. And this could be partly, it's the inspector that says this line. So the euphemism here to soften this could be to try and protect Eva, really, and to say, look, she doesn't want to live this kind of life, but she had to live another kind of life because of the circumstances, right? What's interesting is that probably actually converges with Mr. and Mrs. Burling, because they probably also would rather use euphemism and soften how Eva Smith is treated, because it would make them feel less guilty about the part that they had to play in her life. There are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. That's a really good quote as well. So this one here, it just highlights the size of the problem. What I'm realizing is that this is not a very good PowerPoint slide for adding these comments, so I apologize for that. But the fact there are millions and millions of people, this establishes J.B. Priestley's point, which is that there's a huge chaotic issue with the entire working class, and the whole system needs to be rethought a little bit to give them a bit more dignity and a bit more opportunity, so that they don't end up like Eva Smith. And as I said, the quote goes on, millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. So J.B. Priestley uses a female victim because I think that no one would argue that in 1912, working class women had it the worst. I would then say probably working class men had it the second worst, right? But he includes John Smith's in here just to make sure that it's clear that it's not like that the problem is exclusively one section of society. It's the whole system has problems and they need fixing. Afterwards, she told me she didn't want to go in. So this is Eric's rape of Eva. This is just a hideous, hideous moment in the play as we see that Eric, whilst drunk, but still no excuse, of course, at all in any universe, has forced himself upon this poor, sweet girl. And it's just the ultimate insult and the ultimate decline, really, the ultimate fall. She's had no circumstances where she's had any real comfort in her life. And now, not only that, but she's not even able to sell her body, which is already a terrible fate, but she's having her body stolen from her. It's just disgusting. It adds this deep pathos for her character. A person watching this play in 1945 would have felt a great, I mean, we feel it now as well, of course, but a great sympathy for Eva. Many of them would have remembered the world of 1912 because they'd have been maybe in their middle or late ages in 1945, if say they were sort of a teenager in 1912, right? And so it really does convincingly sort of say that something needs to change. She didn't want me to marry her. She said I didn't love her. Now, this is really interesting because despite Eva Smith's lowly status, lack of opportunities, lack of everything, she's incredibly noble and spirited. She doesn't try to get rid of her baby because she assumedly has a principle that she doesn't want to do that. Also, perhaps at the time it was more taboo to talk about, think about terminating pregnancies and that sort of thing. But she doesn't go down that route. She also doesn't marry a man that offers purely because he got her pregnant. She wants to marry someone that she actually loves or cares about or can see a future with. She doesn't want to just love someone for their money. So that makes her very, very noble. And again, that helps our perception of the working class. The working class, the way that the Burlings speak about the working class, you know, Mrs. Burling says, oh, girls of that class, really dismissive. And Arthur is the same. He's like, oh, she probably got into trouble, didn't she? They're expecting that because she's a working class girl that she would, you know, be lower than them or make bad decisions. But no, that's not Eva. Eva is intelligent, she's noble, she's principled. And it makes us as audience members just, this is a message that we understand fully in 2022 anyway, but that there's no difference between someone who's born impoverished versus someone who's born richer in terms of their abilities. Like you can be smart and noble and principled and great, even if you haven't got a penny to your name, right? And she doesn't. She's alone, friendless, and almost penniless. There's that tricolon, which emphasizes how sad of an existence she lives. Yeah, so these negative descriptions of her from Sybil, girls of that class, it's very dismissive and patronizing. And then on top of that, you've got, as if a girl in her position would ever refuse money, the exclamatory sentence there, again, dismissive, patronizing, looking down on Eva Smith as if she's less because of the fact she's working class, all builds into that class division of the time. But then there's this other thing about how she's described physically. And, you know, subtly, the play does seem to imply that women, particularly of 1912, were valued mostly on their looks and nothing much else. So Eva Smith was a lively, good-looking girl, country bred, I fancy. So the fact that men like Alderman Megati try and force themselves on her, Gerald falls in love with her, Eric, you know, forces himself on her. All of this suggests that her main value, particularly to men at this time, is in her physical appearance, not in who she is, but in what she looks like. That just adds another level of disgust, I think. Sheila learns to be more socially responsible through her terrible decision to get Eva fired and her discovery. She says, but these girls aren't cheap labor, they're people. So you've got that juxtaposition. And the juxtaposition helps us to see that Sheila does change. We'll talk more about Sheila in coming weeks. And then the fact that Eva Smith dies in agony and that she was going to have a child, this all generates more pathos for her as well. You've got this pathos for the character, this pity that we have of the tragedy of her life. Right, so those are some good key quotes for you. I've got a few minutes now to try and do a paragraph for you, model paragraph like normal on Eva Smith. So we're going to keep that same format as we have for the last couple of weeks. We did a paragraph, I think, on the inspector first week, Mr. Burling last week, we'll do Eva this week. So how is Eva Smith presented and why is she significant? I'm going to, I thought it was the apocalypse out there. I'm going to do the fact that she represents a time when women were oppressed. I think that that's a good paragraph. She does represent oppression. She represents a need for change. So one of the ways in which Priestley presents Eva and makes her a very significant character in the play is through the way that she is victimized and oppressed. We see this throughout the play, but particularly grotesquely in her interactions with Eric and Alderman Legacy. With Eric, the quote, "She told me she didn't want me to go in," is very dark and disturbing. And the subtext, so this is where we're getting into techniques. The subtext of the quote is that Eric raped Eva since she did not consent to have sex with him, but was worried that he would make a row. That's another just one word quote. He sort of says that he was going to make a row. So she lets him in out of a choice of it would be more painful potentially for him to start going off. And she was perhaps scared as well, which is just terrifying. This terrifying lack of control that Eva, this terrifying lack of control that for Eva generates a huge amount of pathos from the audience and reminds us that she has so little opportunity in the world of 1912 or in the Edwardian era of 1912. This is further highlighted. I'm just going to go off on one. This is further highlighted when Alderman Megarty wedged her into a corner of Alice Bar. The verb wedged is claustrophobic, disturbing, and again alludes to the lack of choice that Eva / Daisy Renton has in this moment. Then we've got to do a little bit of context. So this is significant when considering J.B. Priestley, an ardent socialist who believed that capitalism was fatally flawed, particularly for the working class, even more so for women. I'm going to give you one extra thing just to show off, and because I've got a teeny bit more time, well, I really don't have more time, but finally, this parallels the general lack of choice women had in 1912. They were not even afforded the right to vote at this time. There we go. So there you go, everyone. That's a little bit of a longer model than I normally do, but I want to give you as much value as I can. If you like the video, please like it. If you have any questions, please comment. Had a couple of interesting questions so far on a couple of videos. Would love to get more. Yeah, I will catch up with you next time. Thanks very much.